Good morning and welcome to History Matters. And this has happened once before. And actually, I think it might have been an episode where we talked about history, why history matters, because I went to review them before doing this one. And sure enough, that was another occasion in which I had green juice because I didn't have time to make coffee. So I'm history matters, and so does the health of green juice. Okay, there we have actual coffee.
Actual coffee, you can see it. Yeah.
At any rate, as I said yesterday, somewhat earlier than I normally do, which I'm proud of, today we're going to be talking about presentism. Big topic. Hopefully we'll at least shear off the edges of it. But before we begin, I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. My favorite thing about Fridays is being with all of you. And today we're going to have a great chat with Joanne for about 30 minutes. Those of you who are with us on Zoom, you've got a very robust chat already going this morning. And I think our friends from Facebook probably do the same. But if you have questions at any time during Joanne's talk, we want you to put those down in the Q&A, and I will look for them there in about 30 minutes. All right. Thanks, guys. See you in a bit.
Excellent. And I will also say, anyone who is here for the first time, please let us know. We want to know folks who are here, and particularly because this amazing community will welcome you heartily. So just let us know if you are new. And that will be a fine and wonderful thing. Okay. Okay, so presentism. So let me give you a moment of background and then a moment explaining what I'm not going to be doing this morning. So as far as background, I think I said this at this point. I'm tweeting, posting, tooting, spouting, whatever it is, I'm doing all of them. And I think I mentioned in all of those formats, what had sparked this topic for me was an article that came out this past week. And it did indeed spark my interest. But that's why I'm feeling that it's important for me to say right here at the outset, I'm not interested this morning in focusing on a particular magazine article, nor am I interested this morning in attacking a specific person. I really want to talk about the topic. And as we often do, I'll start in a moment doing this, what it means in addition to why it's important and what it can tell us. So I just wanted to sort of set my definitions for what we're going to do this morning, because I'm not interested and never interested actually in attacking individuals, but the topic of presentism, both in the work of historians, and we'll discuss this a little bit too, I'm sure, during my comments, but I would bet in the question period among educators and teachers of history as well. Where does the present fit? Now, we are going to start with definitions, and this is particularly interesting. I like to do that. I do that in my work. If you go back and look at my books, very often I'll mention something that seems as though it might have an obvious definition, and then I'll offer the actual definition at the time, which is usually different. So definitions are an important way to begin. And we see all the time, and we've talked about here many times, words like woke that actually don't have a specific meaning, and that's part of their power for the people who are angry at it. So definitions, terms, that's always a useful place to start. In the case of presentism, I bet you will have the same experience. You know, I'm always intrigued to see what comes up just in a generic, no skills needed Google search, and then I kind of hone in on the questions I'm interested in. In both categories of searching this morning, there are so many definitions, understandings, complaint about, praise about presentism. And I just want to even, lay out a few that I found without looking for them. And I think this is, as with so many other things, and I suppose you could say as with woke, part of what's happening in what has been a long-standing discussion, right? So this is not new to the present. What role, particularly for historians, when people who are producing historical scholarship, where does the present fit? And the added bonus of the particular moment right now of in what ways do current crises shape how we're looking at the past. But some by presentism mean actually activism, right? So for some people, presentism, they mean people who are just addressing the past purely for the purposes of the present and aren't interested really necessarily in understanding the past, even in service of understanding the present. So some people mean activism. Some people think, well, presentism is like being focused on current politics, public policy, right? That's presentism. Others mean, for some, presentism has more to do with audience, suggesting that real scholars address the past and address other scholars, and that people who are, at least in some of their work, addressing different audiences. Is their work scholarship? Is their work historical scholarship? That's another question people toss around. I have strong feelings about some of these, but I'm just laying them out here at the beginning. Some people by presentism mean judging everything in the past according to present standards and values. I have a whole list here. I can't even, there's so many that I'm going to skip over some of the ones that I copied down. But here for this particular week, I was struck when I was doing the research for it by the sheer, number one, the sheer number of understandings of it. And number two, there are many forums in which historians either write essays. There's apparently a recent cluster of books by scholars addressing this topic. I think, I believe it's mentioned in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Lynn Hunt, historian of the French Revolutionary period, wrote a very well-known brief piece on presentism in 2002. So we're also not talking about something that's brand new. Historian David Armitage wrote a piece, I think it's called In Defense of Presentism. There's a lot about this. So if you didn't know that before, now you do. There's a lot. And that's because it number one, because it matters. Number two, because as historians, our job supposedly is looking at the past and understanding the past, and that leaves a big open space for how we're supposed to address the present. Part of what I'm going to suggest this morning is that there's a pretty wide spectrum of things that I would consider to be the teaching of history or historical scholarship. So perhaps part of my answer to this question is going to be imposing limits and standards that suggest only one thing counts is not a useful thing to do, and rules out a lot of other kinds of insights we can get from different kinds of history, reaching different kinds of audiences. Another thing I want to do at setting terms here towards the start of this discussion is, in a sense, we always bring the present into the past. How can we not? We live in this moment. We understand certain things in a way that perhaps people didn't before. We have questions that are different from questions that people had before. We're sensitive to different crises and different words and different factors and different phenomena than people in the past. We always bring the present into the past. So first of all, even that alone complicates what we mean when we say presentism. When you are training, I was about to say grad students, but I also talk about this in my undergrad courses. When you are teaching students how to address a work of historical scholarship, one of the first things that you do is either ask them, when was this book written, and then discuss how might that have shaped what the book's about, what the book concludes, what questions the book is asking, why the book was written, when it was written. The first thing you do is say, okay, and what role did the present, when this was written, shape this piece of scholarship? It's always there, right? We write in our present, and it is better for us to acknowledge that fact and that no one is entirely divorced from the present when they're doing historical scholarship, than it is to somehow pretend that you can divorce yourself from the present. I don't think you can. Doesn't mean that we should only look through a modern day lens. But again, part of the problem in my rummaging around this morning and looking up definitions and thinking about this is there are many attempts floating around out there to draw lines in the sand, right? This is history, this is not. This is the right kind of history, this is not. These are historians, these are not. This is scholarship, this is public policy addressing. There are all kinds of attempts to essentially create a right and wrong way of doing history, which I don't think are useful to sort of impose that, because I don't think that kind of clear distinction exists. And also because I think it does something that we should not be doing probably ever, but particularly now, which is closing off the voices of some historians and teachers who are addressing things in a different way. There should be many voices addressing many audiences about history in a purely historical, as much as you can say you're looking at the past and not the present manner, and in a way that perhaps does have something to do with our understanding of the present and how understanding the past might help us better understand the present. There are no clean lines in the sand in this topic, and that's part of, I think, what set some people off, including me, over recent days, was you can't say that addressing the public and not necessarily only addressing scholars means that you're irretrievably presentist, only addressing the present, have some kind of agenda. We want to think about what we mean, and we want to acknowledge there's no clear line in the sand, and we should have a lot of different kinds of voices addressing lots of different audiences right now. Now, I want to focus on a specific question, which I think is a great example of being presentist or not being presentist. I need my coffee. And raised one more issue about what acknowledging the present does in helping us to look at the past. And then we will run out of time. We can open things up to questions. So, one way in which the first thing, of course, that I thought about, because how does one not immediately try and, if you're a historian writing about historians in the present, you think about yourself in the present, right? And every Friday morning, right, I at the end of our discussions here, I say, thank you for engaging in the conversation of democracy. A lot of the work that I'm doing right now is centered on helping people understand what democracy is, how it was created, and what it didn't mean, how meanings have changed over time, how it was conceived of working when people actually finally accepted democracy as the goal. I spent a lot of time in one way or another writing, teaching, lecturing about democracy. What is it? How does it work? And part of why I'm doing that, of course, is because of the current moment, because I do feel that people fundamentally don't understand what it is or what it means or how it works. And I think it's impossible for people to deal with the current moment unless they at least enter the modern arena with a basic understanding of just the working of American democracy. This very thing is, and I know I've mentioned this before at some point, is part of what pulled me onto social media, was the fact that I would be tossing off into the land of social media. At that point, it was into Twitter land, things that felt to me that they were obvious historical or political truths, and people were thanking me because they didn't know. 3 branches of government, each with a different, as I sort of smilingly called it, superpower, right? 3 branches of government is pretty basic, and people didn't necessarily understand or know that. Same thing, there's all kinds of people who are claiming what democracy is, or saying, and this just makes my heart sad, well, we tried democracy, somehow assuming it's just like a modern thing. And now we can try something else. It's like, yeah, okay, that doesn't really display to me a full understanding of what democracy is, how it isn't any one thing. And as we've said here more than once, that it's a process and not an endpoint. But at any rate, yes, a lot of my work right now and in the recent few years is centered in one way or another on promoting the understanding and appreciation of democracy. Is that politicized? Yes. Right? I mean, we are in a moment, there are many crises of democracy happening in the moment. You can't say that in speaking about democracies that you somehow are not addressing the present, because in some way you are. Am I saying you need to understand democracy because we must crush all people who do not agree with us? Oh, actually, what I want to do is say, this is what it means. You take that knowledge and go where it takes you, right? If you have to understand, in the case of this topic, what democracy is before you can adequately, usefully, or successfully judge what's happening now. That's teaching, that's history. And because in the case of much of the work I do, it's grounded in historical understandings of democracy, historical ignorance about democracy, the actual creation of democratic processes of government, I'm not just speaking to the present about the present with the present. I'm saying, well, here, let's understand how we got to this current moment of democracy, how people understood democracy in the past. Let that help us understand what democracy really can mean and has meant and might mean in the future. Makes us much more equipped to deal with the current moment. Another way in which obviously the present has a vital role in addressing the past is the question of slavery, right? And what I'm saying here in particular, there are many ways in which you can't remove the present from the past, but even just thinking about scholarship that is academic scholarship, because of where we are in the present, because of the last few decades of events and thought and other scholarship and new realizations, we are asking new questions. We are sensitive to new things. We are recognizing new evidence. We are approaching the question of slavery in a different way because we are in a different time and we're sensitive to different things. You know, if you went back a certain amount of time, you would see a lot of scholarship about the institution of slavery in a general way, and maybe slave holders and what their world was like. You know, we have work now that, like Manisha Sinha's book, The Slave's Cause, it's talking about how Black people were working and fighting against slavery, right? It's talking about Black protests. It's talking about a lot of things that people wouldn't necessarily have been either sensitive to or as interested in or would feel as immediate as it does now. So in some ways, you know, let me back up for a moment. Years and years and years ago, I went to an eye doctor and I did the deadly thing. He said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a historian." And he was a very good eye doctor, actually, the best I've had in a long time. However, when I said that, he said, "Oh, I hope you're not one of those revisionist historians." And I was like, how do I go into this? Because ultimately, all history is revisionist history, right? That question comes from a place that assumes that there is this block of history that exists and that everything else around it somehow that brings a new meaning or asks a new question or shows a new thing or draws a new conclusion is somehow modern and revisionist and bad, which of course isn't how it works. In a sense, all history is revisionist because we're always revising our sensitivities and our understandings and our questions and our interests based on where we are. You know, it's for good reason, for example, that there is more scholarship now on violence, and particularly political violence, but just generally speaking, in recent years, there's been a growing interest in violence. I wonder why that is. There's a great interest in scholarship scholarly questions, new understandings of race in American history. Is that presentist? Well, yeah, we're in a moment where race is front and center in our political situation, but that means that we're focused on it, we're interested in it, we want to understand it better, we have different questions to ask, and we can look to the past to seek some understanding of the present. Now, this isn't saying that it's a wonderful thing to go to the past, see something, and then immediately apply it to the present, right? Without historical understanding, without context. So going to, the 1918 flu crisis and then saying, well, they did this then, so we should do this now. Less useful because it's pulling things out of time. You can do something like look to the 1918 flu crisis and see what worked and what didn't, and what made it worse and what made it better, and draw some conclusions about public-minded health as it worked then, and then think about how that applies to the present. But it is another way in which there are fuzzy boundaries. You can't cleanly take the past and stick it on the present and assume that that actually will be, in the end, super helpful. Right? It's the same thing with people who look back to the Democratic or the Republican parties of the mid 19th century and say, well, my party, this is my party, and we, parties, I say this all the time when I teach and when I lecture, there are no straight lines in political history. You can't go from Republicans in one century to Republicans in another century, and the same for Democrats. The names, the words are similar. Everything around it changes, and what they stand for changes, and why they're important changes. So again, I think we are always revising history. We are always taking the present into the past. We can't help it. And I think in some ways, am I teaching about democracy because I think people need it to address the present? Yeah. So you can say, oh, Joanne, she's so presentist. She's addressing a topic because of it's important in the present. I don't think that's irresponsible, nor do I think that isn't scholarship, right? One of the things that certainly historians train at, very often people will say, well, what's the difference? Why can't anybody write history? Well, anybody can write history. One of the things that distinguishes scholarly works is that historians train for years in context. They learn about a period broadly. They learn about evidence from that period. They learn about questions to ask or not to ask. They learn about what was normal and what was exceptional. All of those things shape how they understand the past. I was just writing about this recently, and why some works, some popular biographies make a similar mistake. And that is, they look at a character from the past without necessarily a very broad understanding of historical context in the past. They're looking at a person, and you can say people are people and accomplishments are accomplishments. But what they do is they analyze that person in isolation and then praise that person for things that seem extraordinary, which, if you know the historical context, actually everybody was doing, and don't praise them, or at least acknowledge that they were doing things that others weren't doing and that deserve attention. So in other words, if you are judging the past purely on the basis of the present and claiming that that's scholarship, that's less helpful, right? You need to understand the past in some way based on historical evidence, and then decide who you're addressing, how you want to address them, why you're doing this. All of those things matter. So I see that we're almost out of time here. Let's see if there's more that I want to say. No, I guess in the end, I'll close with this and then open this for a discussion. I guess in the end, what I'll say about presentism is condemning it. Presentism is bad, and particularly without defining it, somehow suggests that history is some other place that has no connection to anything that came afterwards, that somehow we can divorce ourselves from our current moment and go into the past. We can't. There aren't those kinds of clear boundaries, fixed lines. What we need to be is aware of the ways in which we are being shaped by our present, right? Why am I interested in this? What questions am I asking that reflect the current moment? What questions am I not asking that actually might reflect the current moment? How am I bringing the present into the past? How might that be shaping the questions I'm asking and the conclusions I'm drawing? And then once I understand that, I will have a better grip on precisely what it is I'm studying and what I want to say about it. Really, it's awareness of where you are and what you're bringing to your teaching of history or your study of history or your writing of history. It's that awareness of where you are, who you are, and why you have a certain interest that's important to know, right? You just need to understand and acknowledge we all have a bias because we all are here and we're all looking back at the past with the benefit of hindsight, and people in the past were looking forward in time, right? So in and of itself, we're always in the present in some way or another, distorting how we understand the past. But I don't think that means that somehow or other the study of history is divorced from the present. It can't be. I'll give you one teaching example and then I'll stop because I'm really curious to see what you folks have to say about this. I taught, so normally I teach political history, early American political history courses at Yale. And normally, pretty much, we either are reading books about the past or we're reading evidence from the past. In the past of my teaching, I have not specifically addressed the current moment in any way. Within the last couple of years, the students actually privately, independently came to me and said, I can't be alive now and not think about bigger questions that apply to the present that are coming from what you're teaching, which I understood. I totally understood. So I did something. I did it. This was a Zoom teaching year, I think. So we were like right in the middle of it, that I hadn't done before. And I hedged it in with a lot of, sort of specifics of how we were going to do it. But I basically said, look, for most of the class, we're going to understand the past, look at the past, think about the past, read evidence from the past, draw conclusions about how it worked and what we can learn from it in a general kind of way. For the last, 20 minutes, 15 minutes of every class, we will have a period when we can address what that learning says about the present. Now, I said, number one, there will be no condemning people as right or wrong in that discussion. There will be no, attack and resist. It's not about being personal. It's not about even being advocates. It was about thinking about the present like protests. We learned about protests in the past. We then, in the last 20 minutes of the class, talked about protests in the present. And we talked about things like, okay, well, you can see how in the past, people weren't sure where they drew the line. So what qualifies as protest? What's protest and what's violence? What does it mean if we draw those lines in different places? How did protest, how is that encompassed in people's understanding of the rule of law and even the Constitution? To what degree do we have a right to protest? These are really important questions, and they clearly impinge on current moments and people who are claiming that certain things are protests, certain things are not, et cetera, et cetera. But it wasn't, in the sort of way that some people assume that there's like crazy indoctrination going on, particularly in colleges. The point of that exercise was for students to ask questions of the present and think about what the past can do to help them ask these questions and think about answers. I think that's responsible. I think that, again, it was very successful. The students actually not only were not attacking each other, but were building off of each other or saying, well, I see another way of seeing that in a way that we should be fostering, in a way that should be happening. I'm now getting all up on my soapbox. So I will back down and say clearly, the present in a variety of different ways is present in how we understand the past, how we look at the past, what we ask of the past, and what we do with it in the present. That is just a fact. And I think there are many ways to factor that into what you do, to be aware of the degree to which you're doing it, to talk to different audiences in different ways in the present because of the moment that we're in, to use our historical skills, to use deep research, to use deep knowledge, to get a really deep understanding of the past and bring that as scholars into the present and have that be here as useful fodder, not a direct equivalence. All of those things I think are important. And in the moment that we're in, you might say, okay, Freeman's talking about democracy all the time. I guess, she's an activist. Am I an activist for democracy, generally speaking? Yeah, I think it's great. And I think we should be defending it. And I think people don't necessarily understand what it is. And I think they need to understand what it is and its shortcomings and how it hasn't worked and how it has worked and what that means about its strengths and weaknesses. Knowing all of those things, how does that not better equip you to think about the current moment? Okay, I can see people are already saying, mug. If there's anyone here new, we've been doing this. This is the 153rd, I think, straight week of doing this.
I think so. Is that right, Carolee? Or somebody? Tim, Tom?
So for 153 weeks, pretty much 153, I come equipped with a mug that in some way or another addresses the topic at hand. I do not own 153 mugs, so I'm sorry to say people are seeing like repeat mugs. Okay. I know I've used this one before, but it's applicable to this discussion in a way that is new. It is. Today we are making history.
Oh.
How many meanings does that have in light of today's discussion, right? We are here in the now, today, thinking about history, writing history, and also thinking history with our understandings. So anyway, yes, that is today's mug. I will also say I love this mug. And I think someone sent me this mug. I'm so bad, folks. You have to know my total inability to remember who sends what is not because I don't appreciate what you send. To the bottom of my heart, I can't even tell you how much that makes me happy, because then I know out in the world, people are hearing and thinking about what we do. I don't remember titles of books either, historical scholarship. I don't remember a lot of things.
That's why we have Tim. He always looks up the books for us.
At any rate, assuming that someone did send this to me, because I don't remember buying it for myself, it's absolutely on topic. Okay.
Carolee might be able to check the mug spreadsheet and figure out who gave you that mug.
Okay.
There's pens you can use to write on China.
Oh, like I could put on
signing the bottom of the mug, right? And then we'll remember who brought it.
Interesting.
Remember that, guys. Okay, we have some questions. We have a couple that people have said, save this for the after party, so I will. Okay, our good friend Gloria is
Bess.
Oh, what?
Bess, it was her. She found it in Colonial Williamsburg. Thank you, Bess. Okay, I want to give you full credit.
I can look for that mug. Okay, maybe I can get one. Okay, our good friend Gloria. Hi, Gloria. Gloria asks, how do we distinguish between presentism, that is using history, from that which is using the present to understand the past? She's asking if sometimes it can be used inflammatory, or is it used for partisan purposes in that way? So how can we tell the difference when they're doing it to understand the past versus some sort of partisan?
Well, I think what's important here is that question, right? That to understand that there are some people who are looking to the past purely for current moments, and there are other people looking to the past in a more scholarly way, and there are other people looking to the past. There are any number of ways of looking at, studying, researching, and applying the past. It is true that you might read something and be unaware that it is intended to be inflammatory or propaganda or anything else. I would say when you read things, particularly things that have a moral judgment attached to them and not a lot of content, we've talked about this a lot. Always ask why you're reacting and how you're reacting to what you're reading, and why the writer might want you to do that. This doesn't mean we should not ever have any morality at all in anything we do. Again, we can't do that. And I think particularly when you're studying slavery, determining that it is bad, that's something difficult, I would hope, to deny. But I think your awareness of why you do what you do is just as important as the awareness of others and who they're writing to and what they appear to be intending to do, and how much of what they're doing appears to be grounded only on judgment and not on historical evidence, how much of it appears to be cherry picking, right? Supreme Court decisions. But a number of Supreme Court decisions that, in my point of view, used history irresponsibly, cherry picked in history to say, this is the way it was, and thus this is the way it is now. People came forward and said, actually, that's not how it was. This is how it was, in a very straightforward way, right? Whatever the thing is, and I'm not going to go into the politics of specifically what we were talking about. You all are thinking about them in your head right now. This thing was legal at this point. It has not always been illegal. It was legal. It was accepted. So don't act as though Americans have always hated this thing and ruled it out. That's not true. There is a case in which someone made an assertion and then others stepped forward and said, let's look at historical content. So there's not an easy answer to that, but part of the answer to that is part of what we practice here every week, which is asking questions about what you're reading, asking questions about what you're teaching, thinking about purposes, and motives, and inspiration, and then drawing conclusions. It's in a sense, it's the same thing we want to teach students to do, which is careful reading, close reading, evaluating evidence. I think, there is no clean line in the sand where you can say, do this thing, and you will immediately understand. All pure propaganda. If that were true, propaganda wouldn't work. So, we have to be aware of the fact. We have to be aware of the fact that that question needs to be asked, I guess, is part of my answer to it.
Yeah. And our friend Tim just put like the most interesting thing in the chat. He said, if you go back to a Wikipedia article on presentism and look at the edits, like,
oh, interesting.
The article, that is very deep, Tim. And now I'm going to do that as soon.
Oh, totally worth doing, because that was one of the places when I was casting about, I was like, I wonder, how does Wikipedia identify it? And it felt to me like they hadn't quite fully decided what they wanted to do, but looking at the edits, I had not thought of, and that's fascinating. Yeah.
Going back at a Google Doc and look at the revisions. And the thing is, Wikipedia has gotten really strict in the last couple of years because so many people were going in and changing things to fit a certain political narrative. It got so ugly that they started locking certain topics down. So what started off as the People's Encyclopedia that everybody had a say in, they suddenly had to say, no, you can't edit an article on these politicians or this political, because people were going in and just putting nonsense, and which makes
me like who was it years ago who claimed
Sarah Palin started with the Liberty Bell. That's when that's the first article.
Paul Revere, right? And someone went in and like changed what Wikipedia said.
It's about Paul Revere and the Liberty Bell, and she got it incorrect, which is fine. But then people were going in and changing it to fit what she said instead of
correct. Exactly.
Right. And then the Paul Revere people got mad. So that was the first time I know of that Wikipedia locked an article. But now in the last 4 years, it has gotten like, we tried to put something up recently, and it wasn't even a controversial topic. And the Wikipedia people said, no, your sources aren't scientific or academic enough. You need to find better sources or you can't post this. And that article would have gone through no problem 5 years ago. So it's just interesting to do that. But the other thing is, have you, Joanne, or your students ever done an edit-a-thon?
No.
Okay, so this is a cool thing. So Wikipedia, they had a bad rap for a long time that they weren't academic enough. Kids shouldn't use it for sources, but an art professor, I want to say, had kids go in and update articles about artists or works of art. as an exercise in her class. And the Wikipedia people were like, oh, this is great. This makes us look legit. So they started saying training materials.
Oh.
And the other thing was they talked about how there's more men than women represented in Wikipedia and not enough people, diverse people. So they started this whole trend of these editathons so that people could go in and make a little bit more well-rounded Wikipedia. So it's just a really interesting activity that we've done sometimes with students. Okay, back to questions. Miriam asked, are there many areas that previously weren't considered legitimate or worthy areas of historical study at one time, such as women's history, or in her case, you know, she's the costume or the history of clothing. She says, our present interest and focus dictate what we consider worthy of study in history, but is this considered presentism? Why or why not?
Well, that's an interesting question. And even that was addressed in some of the things I was reading in preparation for this. You know, there some people, in particular, I think Lynn Hunt in 2002, part of her worry about presentism is that students are only interested in the present and they're not interested in history of other times. And that history departments and the teaching of history has become, at that point, you know, 20th century centric. And I think that's true. It makes sense that people growing up in the present want to understand it, and that's the first thing they go to. It doesn't mean people aren't studying the past. I don't think that in and of itself is a useful distinction to draw. And now I totally forgot where I'm going. So repeat for me the question, Andy. So that
I was asking if there were certain things that were considered worthy of being taught in history versus the present.
Oh yeah, well, for sure.
Topics like women's history, history of clothing.
Yeah, not only that, women's history is a great example of that. The history of emotions, emotions, you know, I'm so interested in how emotions shape politics. That's a semi-recent, history of understanding, semi-recent. There's, excuse me, a biography of Abigail Adams, and it's not the recent one by Woody Holton. Maybe it's by Edith Gellis. And it has at the beginning of it a sort of history of how we have treated Abigail Adams. And, you know, she marches through like, well, first, she wasn't seen as important at all. Then she was seen as the helpmeet. She helped her husband, but she was only seen in that way. Then she was seen as someone sort of, you know, off doing her own things in a different story. You can see over time how women were allowed into the topics that were important to understand, and how increasingly, and I think Woody Holden's book is an example of this on Abigail Adams, women now are just in the story. They're part of the story. We, you know, taking them out and saying they don't affect the larger history is a little bonkers. So you can see how that evolves and that changes over time. And that can be, you know, when I certainly ask graduate students to write, as I do in some of my classes, a historiographical essay on a topic. What I'm asking them to do is to look at how a topic has been addressed differently over time, the different questions people have asked, the ways in which each group influenced the next one, right? So each group came along, looked back to what had been done, and then said, I'm going to do something different. You can understand not even just current events, but the arcs of scholarship and the different questions we ask and the different conclusions we've drawn, and the things that have been left out and not studied because they weren't there in a way that people expected. People are asking all kinds of questions, looking at all kinds of evidence. Material culture is as one example of taking that seriously as, you know, a field of study semi-recently seen. It's not brand new, but at any rate, of course, you know, over time, particularly the long span, but even in the short span, we get interested in different things and ask different questions.
Yeah. And I was just putting in the chat, that's how our bunk website got named, was the Henry Ford quote about all of his more or less bunk. Right? So it just made me think of that when you were talking about presentism. Okay, Dave, our good friend Dave, who is in the hospital. Dave had gallbladder surgery. I believe he's tuning in from the hospital.
Oh, Dave.
I wanted to ask a question. Oh my gosh, I just love you, Dave. We hope you feel better. How does Dr. Freeman respond when she is defending democracy and the response is that we don't have a democracy, we have a republic?
Oh, yeah. And I was out in the social media land describing that. And I do address that. And one thing that I have done in the past, and it was interesting in at least one case, because sometimes you can actually have a dialogue rather than be screaming at each other. And in at least one case, I went back and forth with someone and then finally said, why are you so negative about acknowledging democracy as part of our political system? Like, why is this so important to you that democracy isn't part of the American political system? And he said, I'm not going to do it justice, but he said something like, well, democracy is like kind of primitive, and I think it's kind of lowly. And he went off on something which, first of all, led me to think he doesn't really fully understand what democracy is, or he does, and that says a lot about his politics. I don't know. Normally, what I will say to that question is, we are a democratic republic. We're a republic grounded on democratic processes. Sometimes I'll get in an argument with people. Again, a lot of this is social media stuff. And they'll say, no, we're a constitutional republic. And I'll say, yeah, and the Constitution creates democratic processes of government. So don't try that on me. We are, right? We are not a perfect democracy. We are a republic in the sense that we are a representative government. But democracy is at the basis of our political process and our understanding, at least in the past, of what we should be aiming for, if not what we have not quite achieved. This gets to a point I've made before, that democracy is a process and not an end point. We have not achieved democracy in a sense that is entirely fair. We have not. And to my mind, that does not mean, oh, well, it can't work. It means try harder, work better, think better, change behavior, do what you need to do to push some improvement, being fully aware that that might cause a pushback and you might have to go up that hill again. So that's part of my answer is democracy is built in to our political system. It just is. Yes, the founders had a different understanding of it, but they also understood that what they were doing was really different from a monarchical system of government. And we are a republic, and you could be both of those things at the same time. People are really adamant about that. And as I suggested earlier, sometimes they're adamant about ruling out democracy as part of the process, because once you let democracy in, now you have to ask interesting questions about rights and who has rights to do what, and who should have power or not. Those are, for some people, messy questions to ask. But we are a democratic republic.
Yeah. And there's a poem floating around by Merle Feld that I think Tim mentioned it, and Rabbi Beth found it, that talks about how men wrote history because women literally had their hands full with babies and everything else back in the day. And that's why it's so male. So that's kind of a cool.
Well, like me writing my first book, Affairs of Honor, on the what I call the grammar of political combat in the 1790s. I started by working, I wrote about the use of political gossip as a tool, a political tool. Actually, just all kinds of gossip as a political tool. And I started by using Jefferson and a gossip log of sorts that he kept for himself. And I worked on that for a while. I drew all kinds of conclusions. And then at a certain point, I said, there haven't been a lot of women in Jefferson's gossip log. You know why? Because he believed that women were in a totally separate realm and should be talking about politics. They should be engaging in other things, right? So I didn't ask that question. And without asking that question, I was just seeing what Jefferson saw as important. And, that there was a great moment in which it was like, yeah, actually, I should not just be looking through his eyes. I need to be asking questions. What I see, what I don't see, who he is and what he might do, what others might do. It totally changed my understanding of history.
Yeah. Miriam had a little bit of a naughty quote in the chat, but it was really good. If you get to go back, she says,
Okay.
I'm just going to be naughty. John, you can edit this out later if it's not allowed, but, and I don't know who, she says, Taylor Mack had a quote that said, perfection is for holes, craft is everything. So we were looking at that and the poem. Okay, so we've got a couple more questions. Clinton, our good friend Clinton from, I think, Brooklyn, is that right, Clinton? How do you see the difference between using knowledge of the past to inform the present and imposing present assumptions on writing about history?
Well, I think, as I said, I think in some ways this gets back to awareness as a historian. You know, I wrote about Congress, violence in Congress. I came from a place where I believed that that was possible, right? That could happen. There are people in the past who either wouldn't believe that could happen or saw Congress as too lofty an institution where that was possible that could happen. You have to be aware of what you're thinking and how you're thinking it and how that's shaping what you're doing. For me, that became vitally important because I started this book at least a decade and a half before we kind of got into the current moment. And suddenly I was having an emotional response to the current moment that I finally realized was shaping how I was addressing the book. How could I not? I was like, you know, the most famous example of this in my mind is just no one else knows about it. It's famous to my brain. I was writing about the Northerners finally, you know, fighting, standing up and fighting, and their constituents saying, now there's a North, now they're fighting. And I wanted to understand the sort of intellectual, emotional process by which you get from a point where you think there should not be that kind of violence or fighting in politics, never mind violence, but even just fighting, to the point where you're telling people fight. And as I'm sitting at my desk thinking about that, there's something on the news that I had the TV on probably mostly for the bird of the time, you know, Boo is the bird of the time, to amuse the bird. And I can't remember what it was that happened, but someone said something, and it was, in my mind, I wanted the Democrat to be more aggressive in answering, right? And I said out loud, without even thinking about it, fight. And then I turned around and looked at my computer. Right? I didn't want this person to like pick up his fists, but all of a sudden, you know, there I am having this guttural response, which then led me back to ask different questions about what I was writing about. So I think awareness, given that we are in our present, and it will shape what we are aware of, what we're interested in, what tools we have. We have all these databases. Without them in the past, we cannot ask certain kinds of questions. I tell this to my students all the time, like there's nothing new to say. Like, not only is that not true, you have tools that people a certain amount of time ago did not have, and you can ask different questions. So all of that, I know it feels kind of anticlimactic to say that awareness, being aware of where you are and who you are, and again, how you are bringing not just the present, but who you are into what you study, right? You know, white middle class Jewish American, like, sure, that's going to shape what I do, and that's going to shape how I do it. And I just need to be aware. I might not ask questions that actually need to be asked. That's part of historical training, is figuring out how to ask questions, how to look at evidence in a way that gets beyond you.
Yeah. Okay, we have a couple more questions. We're running out of time. Cece is asking if this would be an example of presentism. She says she works mainly in the history in the 1950s, and that once she was in the vicinity of a scholar was quoting someone verbatim, but doing it in like a mocking voice, and people were laughing. And she was asking, do people mock the language of the 18th and 19th century? When people do that, is that presentism? She finds it upsetting because they're not taking the past seriously, and wondering if that would be an example of presentism.
Well, I think it's perfectly acceptable to think something in the past is funny because it sounds different or foreign in some way. I mean, in a harmless way like this, like the language, right? I don't think that's going to necessarily help you understand what it means or why they're using it or why it stopped being used, right? Those are all interesting questions. But like, you know, I found that surrounding the election of 1800, someone at that point, I think it was George Clinton of New York, who is always referred to by historians as the powerful George Clinton. I think he said, it was written down as kiss my A and go to H. And I was like, they said that in 1800? Really? And they knew it was bad because they didn't write out the full words.
Right.
So I thought that was hilarious.
In the chat.
Pardon?
I said neither did Miriam in the chat.
Oh, okay. I thought that was hilariously funny, but it also then led me to think, we really only see people as they write. This was a transcription of a conversation. It's harder for us to understand how people spoke. We don't write and speak the same way. So that actually, is that presentism? I suppose you could say I'm irretrievably in the present if I'm laughing. Oh my gosh, in 1800 they said this. But then, I thought about what it meant that I thought it was so hilariously funny. And that was part of the answer. Oh, of course. Transcribed conversations are going to offer all kinds of slang and other things that people might say that are not going to be on the printed page.
Yeah. So a follow-up to that, Jim asked, is presentism the new woke, i.e. a methodological problem for historians that non-historians use to devalue the history that they don't like?
Well, right. So I thought about that a little bit this morning, and actually yesterday when I was thinking about the topic, given that last week we talked about woke and the fact that it's deliberately not defined, because then it can basically stand in for things we hate. They're woke, that are somehow leftist, right? Somehow liberal, and thus bad, that defining it specifically is going to make it much less useful. And sure, I think that there are some people who are just pointing at things they don't like that have some bearing on the current moment and saying it's woke, it's woke. Could someone look at my work teaching about what democracy is and say, well, that's woke? It's all about teaching people about democracy and not about the current moment and what democracy really is. It's like, well, I don't think it's, define woke for me, first of all. That's what we talked about last week.
Yeah, last week I was going to say.
Getting beyond that, like, what do you mean by woke? If you mean, am I aware that, there are systems in place of how things work, and they work in different ways in different times, and they don't necessarily work fairly, and that we need to understand that? Yeah, okay, I'm really woke. I think yes. A short answer to that is yes. You can totally use the word presentist in a meaningless way, which is why I started with definitions, and then why I found so few people define it. Try the exercise yourself and you'll see. So yes, I do think people can use it that way. However, I also do think it has useful meanings. You just have to be focused and defined in what it is you're talking about, what it is you're objecting to, and why you're objecting to it, and what does it say about you and your approach in the moment you're in addition to what it says about the period you're studying.
Yeah. Okay, we have 2 questions left, but we're 2 minutes over.
Let's try one and we'll see how long it takes. I'll try and be.
Our good friend Beth, Rabbi Beth says, how can we help people think about history without taking it personal? I'm thinking about the whole issue of making white students feel guilty about racism. That's the argument our governor made last night on CNN in a very big way. Not sure about if she's being clear, but that's the hot button issue. That's what the argument about teaching a full and complete history and the pushback to things like 1619 and all that. That CRT is making white children feel guilty for something that they didn't do.
Well, so I think there are, once again, things being blurred together here. It's one thing to say things are being taught in a way deliberately to make students feel guilty. It's another thing to say that people learning about the past might feel uncomfortable with it. Yep. They might.
Historical empathy. Yep, it's a difference.
That's yes. We will not. No one will smile happily at the past about everything that happened, and there are particular populations of people who have lots of reason to really be uncomfortable with either how they were treating other people or with how other people were treating their people in the past. Yeah, history is about being uncomfortable. So I don't think necessarily, I also don't think necessarily teachers who are acknowledging that bad things happened are somehow trying to impose guilt. I think that that's in part a like weird conspiracy theory thing, like, yes, it's all your fault. Some people out there must be doing that. I don't know. But for the most part, our history, and I've said this many times before, and it's pinned on my Twitter account, right? To really understand our history, you can look at the things that you think are admirable. You can't understand who we are without looking at all of the ugliness too, the complexity, the ways in which we didn't live up to what we wanted to be. It's all one big part of the package. And if you really want to understand the nation, you have to allow all of that into your understanding of it. And so I don't, will we be uncomfortable sometimes with the history we're looking at, either because we personally, for me, like as a white person or as a woman or as who knows what version of me will be upset by something. Yep, it'll happen. And then I'm aware of that. And then I can understand what's happening in the past and think about what that says to me about the present.
Yeah. Okay, Gloria's last question. Gloria wanted to know if you would give your definition of democracy. Some people think that too much democracy is anarchy and unfair.
Okay. I will answer this quickly and then we can go to the after party. First of all, it's not an easy thing to say because it's very complicated. So I will offer you my sort of beginning definition of what it means. So to me, what democracy or a democratic government by American standards needs, it needs accountability in the people who we give power to. It needs representation, or for us to be represented by the people who we actually give that kind of power to. It needs voting rights so that we all have a right to vote. All citizens who have that right should have a right to vote. I think fundamentally, if you want to talk about just what makes democracy work, accountability, representation, voting rights are three big things that are part of the process. You can throw in, the right to protest. You can throw in a free press. All of these things are part of a democratic government, whatever that government is, and it's going to be defined different ways in different countries at different times. But this is why I scream about accountability so often, because that's right smack at the center of it. If people who have power are not accountable for how they use that power, particularly people who we have given political power to, and they're not accountable for what they do with that power, we've just surrendered our power. We're just going to sit back and people are going to do just what they want. Accountability, and we live in a crisis of accountability right now, hugely important. Okay, we're way over. So let me speed up because you guys are asking good questions here. Okay, so what's going to happen now is we are going to segue into the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording what's going on here so that we can be even freer and easier in our conversation. If you beamed in through Facebook, you need to leave Facebook to join the after party. You need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations. And if you go there, click on that link, poof, you will be in the after party. You don't have to join anything, sign anything. You will just be in the after party. And so I said the poof, so someone must have gotten, yep, there we go, bingo, bingo. Those who are new, there are people playing bingo, and I say certain things, even I could name those things, which I won't do now because then everyone will get bingo. But at any rate, I do want to say two things really quickly. Number one, as ever, thank you for being here on a Friday morning and engaging in the conversation of democracy, the kind of conversation, the kind of questions, the kind of concerns, all of the things that you need to have and you need to be able to exchange. Newbie is pitching in here in a way that, allows debate and compromise and the very things that are at the heart of a democratic form of process of politics. So thank you for being here, engaging in this democratic conversation. I want everyone to have a wonderful week. The last thing I want to say before we go into the after party is, we mentioned it at the outset, and I'll mention it again next week, but in 2 weeks from tomorrow, the National Council for History Education, somebody just got bingo, is having its annual conference in Salt Lake City. And that's Saturday morning, 7:30 in the morning, Salt Lake City time. We are going to be doing a live, in front of a live audience, episode of History Matters. So it will be live streamed apparently, so that you can watch this too. And if on the East Coast or in Europe at a much more civil time. But at any rate, it'll be the first time we're doing this in front of a live audience. And so what that means is at least a bunch of us are going to get to be in the same room at the same time, which will be great. But it'll be recorded, it'll be live streamed, and it'll be put online. So it will all be there for you. Okay, I'm going to shut up because time is passing on. Everybody have a really wonderful week. Newbie is peeping happily here, so he's saying the same thing basically in Newbie language. And I will see you and this wonderful community next week.
Yay.
Yay.